Pasta is one of the most popular foods in the world. This slimy noodle in a variety of shapes, mixed with sauces, with a variety of other ingredients, has taken the world by storm. However, few know about the origins of pasta. You may have heard that it was a variety of a Chinese noodle that was brought to Italy by Marco Polo that inspired pasta. However, this is most likely BS. Pasta is probably far older than that, far older than Marco Polo, and has a history mired in darkness before written records. On top of that, much of what we know before history of writing, after all, is even more mysterious because we have to rely on archaeological evidence, and that's quite hard to do with food given that food expires and decomposes. Given the fact that food spoils, studying food history can be particularly difficult before the written record unless you're talking about certain foods that don't disintegrate easily, such as wine or something that is cured in salt. Pasta, at the end of the day, is simply a type of noodle made from unleavened wheat-based doughs mixed with water and eggs, namely egg yolks. This then is formed into planes of dough that are cut into a variety of shapes. Now, generally speaking, this is just the definition of your typical form of pasta. There are plenty of others that are made with black beans or lentils, some that don't have gluten. There are even vegan varieties that don't even include eggs. This is a testament to how sometimes the way we categorize things as human beings don't necessarily work out well in the real world. However, we all know what pasta is when we see it. Generally speaking, in our common vernacular, we refer to pasta as being some sort of quasi-Italian, or at least Italian-inspired noodle, regardless of the specific ingredients. In contrast to, say, noodles, which are fairly similar, but we usually trace back to East Asia. And this is probably where the misconception of pasta being taken from China via Marco Polo on the Silk Road comes from. The more likely scenario is that pasta is actually indigenous to the Italian peninsula to some extent, long before the peoples of this region ever made contact with China. In northern and the central Italian peninsula, there were a group of people called the Etruscans. These were a pre-Indo-European group of people who spoke a language that is very different than modern-day Italian, and again is not even Indo-European. Eventually, the Italic people groups would interact with these Etruscans. Archaeologists would find utensils that may have been used to create some sort of proto-pasta. However, the evidence is patchy, and it's unclear as to whether or not these were used to produce anything like pasta sheets that would eventually be boiled. It's more likely that these were a form of flat dry bread that may have been fried. Romans, later on, probably didn't have anything closely resembling pasta either. Many of the ingredients that modern-day Italians use would certainly be used by the ancient Romans, namely olive oil, wheat flour, garlic, onions, and others. However, they certainly would not have anything like spaghetti or penne or rigatoni, and they definitely did not have tomato sauce, given the fact that tomatoes come from the Americas. While the tall tales of contact with China, namely through Marco Polo, are probably not true, there is a watered-down version of this that is true. It's most likely that a form of proto-pasta that pre-existed in Italy was combined with other forms of proto-pasta that existed in the Middle East. Oftentimes traders took baked goods with them, made out of semolina wheat. If you don't know what semolina is, it's basically a form of coarsely ground wheat that is typically used for baking pasta today. When grounded, they come up with rather rigid shapes and are far more granular and larger than your typical flour. You may have heard of cracked wheat or bulgur wheat. Semolina wheat or flour is somewhat granular like this, although not to the same extent. Because of its unique size and shape, it would be excellent for pasta production. See, semolina wheat comes from a specific species of wheat called durum wheat, which today oftentimes is just called pasta wheat, in sharp contrast to most other forms of wheat that form a soft, powdery flour. These have more coarse granules. This is because the tissue inside the seeds, or endosperms, have higher starch content, which is not only delicious, but also leads to larger and larger chunks. This makes them quite terrible for baking in your typical bread, but it can be very useful when you're boiling the dough. After all, many of the Arab and Berber communities of North Africa would have their own proto-versions of cracked wheat called couscous. If you've ever eaten Moroccan cuisine, you have probably certainly tried couscous. Couscous isn't actually a separate type of plant, or even a separate type of grain. It is rather a sort of dish made from semolina flour. With the rise of various Islamic caliphates, many Arabs and Berbers would conquer much of the land of the Mediterranean, including the Italian island of Sicily, Italy's largest island, and you would see a mix of Proto-Italian culture mixed with Arab culture. Eventually, the Italians would take up a new passion of exploration, as many city-states would emerge in the ashes of fallen empires, and would set up trading missions across much of the Mediterranean and beyond. It became quite useful during these trading missions to be able to have food that could be prepared on board. This would come in the form of food that could be dried and then boiled easily to produce a warm dish. This was not an overnight process, though. You eventually saw various forms of proto-pasta emerge in various Italian city-states and villages, each one using a different method to produce some sort of semolina, wheat, and egg-based dish. Keep in mind that Italy was not actually a country at the time, but rather a collection of aforementioned competing city-states. However, the peninsula was famed for producing excellent mariners, who were hired by various other powerful European states such as Spain and Portugal. These Italian mariners would oftentimes take dried pasta with them to the New World, and these explorers would eventually make contact with the Aztecs and other Mesoamerican people groups who had a fondness for eating tomatoes. Tomatoes most likely trace their origins to Central America, or the Andean regions of South America. Regardless of who first cultivated tomatoes, contact with the New World brought tomatoes to the Old World, and they proliferated across the Iberian Peninsula and eventually found their way to the Italian Peninsula. Some of the most famous Italian mariners were actually from northern city-states like Genoa and Venice. However, eventually these tomatoes would find their way down to southern Italy, most notably the city of Napoli. Napoli would take the world by storm when it came to contributions to cuisine. After all, it is the quasi-birthplace of the pizza. And Napoli was the first place to put the industrialization of pasta making to the test. This is despite the fact that it was usually the northern Italians who were industrializing the most. Now, this is not to say that other parts of Italy did not produce their own unique forms of pasta, though. For example, in northern Italy, there was a lot more Germanic influence, and you saw pasta sauces made from milk, cream, and other dairy products that were easier to find in the north, as tomatoes, generally speaking, preferred warmer temperatures. Eventually, much of the Italian peninsula would be unified. However, these wars of unification would be quite bloody, and in the aftermath, much of southern Italy and Sicily were taken up by the mafia. This political and economic instability, which was rife with extortion rackets and violence, led many Italian farmers to move to other parts of the world, namely the Americas. Cities like New York and Buenos Aires quickly became flooded with plenty of Italians, who spread their Italian culture and influence. Now keep in mind that the food of the Italian diaspora is obviously not the same as the food in Italy itself. They were importing southern Italian cuisine to new lands, and they had to adapt to new cooking methods and new ingredients. This may explain why, for example, Italian American cuisine uses a lot more butter than olive oil in comparison to Italy itself. This is part of the reason why your classic American spaghetti and meatballs is quite different than your Italian version. However, the massive amount of influence coming from Italian diaspora in the United States and others eventually put pasta on the map in Italy, similar to the way that it made pizza a lot more popular in Italy itself. Today, pasta is one of the largest food industries in the world, at least as far as processed food is concerned. And there are so many varieties producing it that I can't even scratch the surface, each with their own fascinating history. But at the end of the day, it all goes back to that slimy dough. I wish we could just go back to pre-Roman times and ask the Etruscans what they would think about what happened to that supposed flat bread that could have been boiled and turned into pasta, how it would revolutionize cuisine 2,500 years later.